Okay, hello. This is how we set up the rear pod on an Exotek F1 Ultra with the little side shocks. So bear with me and we'll get it done. I'm not super scientific on this, but it worked for me. So we got that roar number one spot. So this car is directly off the track. So you'll see some dirt, pardon the dust in the background. We're in the middle of building a car for TCS, so some of that this winter. And like I said, this is directly off the track. Tools you'll need: the Exotek long ride height gauge. It's kind of required versus a standard ride height gauge, so we can measure down in on the chassis and not just the chassis edges like a normal ride height gauge would. And then another tool I like that's not required, the RC Maker tweak wheels go on the side. We'll get to them later. You don't need this, but I think they're nice. If you set your pod up correctly, you probably don't even need them, but I like them for a peace of mind. Alright. Okay, so for congruency, we're kind of just going to do this by the book. Like I said in the beginning, I'm not the most exacting on this, but it works, especially on an F1 car with big rubber tires versus foam tires like a pan car. So first, check your rear ride height. It gives you all the points right there in the manual. A, we'll start there. Obviously that's your that's controlled by the cams in the pod, so there's not much you can adjust there. It is what it is based on your tires and what cams you have, and go from there. So let's measure that. Always give the car a little push, even though it doesn't really affect this measurement. Try and keep the light as best I can. So we're above 4.5. So we'll flip the gauge. It's like right about 5. And that's not one you can really adjust. 5 mils is good. That's what ride tires and I think the 1 cams get you. This is what I was running on the track. Can also see I was running a lot of weight on the rear pod for asphalt. I don't think I'd recommend that for carpet, but asphalt, it gave me a lot of forward drive out of the corners. We were also running the X-ray gear diff with the steel axle for extra weight on the back. Think of it like a drag car. You're coming out of the corners, that weight's going to be pushed on the rear wheel. And also a really open diff. That's going to hinder a little bit of your side bite, so when the car does let go, it's going to keep going like a pendulum. If you ever race two-wheel drive buggy, think of it like that, moving your battery forward and back. Similar. So then we'll go into B. Ensure you have enough ride height. You may experience a car that's loose, it's scraping the track. So I didn't ever have that issue with the ride height, but when I was running on the fast outdoor track with soft side springs and a lot of this extra weight, I was contacting the chassis a lot, as evidenced by all the scrapes. I ended up running the medium side springs, and that actually helped out a lot. It was soft enough with all my weight. It's probably about the same as running soft springs with no extra weight. So to adjust that, top shock turnbuckle for height B, longer link raises the B setting. So that is here, this turnbuckle. So I didn't get super critical on measuring this. I measure the ride height, and then wherever this ends up is what it is. So that also impacts your droop setting as well. So let's see what I have to get a baseline. 4. And this B point is, you're going to be measuring this, not inside the chassis yet. It's right along here on the pod and here. So this you could actually measure with a standard ride height gauge if you want, but it doesn't really matter. You also have to watch you're not contacting something else. Like I have this brass plate here. Make sure I'm not hitting that or the link. So you got to really kind of fish it in there. I'm starting to feel a little bit of contact. And make sure you're not contacting the chassis in there. So we're like about 4 mil, just north of 4 mil. Let's check the other side. And kind of tap on the pod itself. Right at 4. So remember we had 5 back here, 4 here. All right, and that's adjusted by this point. So one way you can think of it is if you push on the battery, which would be like your primary weight point in the chassis, look at what moves a lot. You can see the top shock really springs in and out. The side springs move a little bit, but you're really moving the top shock there. And what will move these side springs is more your side movement. So obviously they work together, and that's why this car is so good on asphalt. It creates a lot of grip. So if you wanted to raise that height point, you would just look at it and do the opposite of what the car does when you push on the chassis. So if you push on the battery, it compresses. You can either turn the spring in or lengthen that. Okay, so it's important to differentiate between the two, extending this versus cranking up the spring. If you crank up the spring, you're going to change the ride height, and the car is going to raise. This total length here will get longer, but you won't have any more droop. So raise your ride height, and that's it. And remember, this car has that internal shock spring, so you have to be careful that you're not compressing that with this outer spring. So that's kind of the key to getting rear grip, is making sure that this is set up correctly, because if you're compressing that internal spring, then you're kind of losing the advantage of why you had that in the first place, this spring. So you want to, it's not something you can measure, you just have to do it by feel. You kind of pull it up the pod, and then you feel some resistance. So right there, I maxed out, that spring's fully compressed. Right here, it's probably uncompressed, and now we're resting on only the outer spring, and that's right about where you'd like it. So if you increase this spring preload, you're going to raise the ride height, but you're not going to add any more droop. If you lengthen this, you're going to increase your total length of the shock, and that'll give you more droop as well as ride height. So it's a balance between the two. Think of it like on a touring car. If you make your shock spring longer, say you didn't have droop screws on your arms, that will give you more droop, or like an off-road car. But obviously you're going to increase your ride height as well. So say if we crank this out, that will make it longer, you'll get more ride height, then you may need to adjust that in. So let's do that now. Let's do it off camera. We'll come back. So remember, we had about 4 on the pod. What I'm going to do now is lengthen this, and then we'll remeasure without adjusting the preload. Okay, so now we're going to increase this length. All you do to that is you hold this point with pliers, and you turn right here with a turnbuckle wrench. I think it's a 4 mil. That's all. So what I've done is I've lengthened this. I haven't touched this. So let's see what our ride height is. It was 4. Now we're a little bit north of 4.5. So, as I said, this affects droop and ride height. So if we pick our car up, pod droop's something that you can measure. I don't really measure it. They tell you how to do it here. You're more or less going to take your car. You have to have 2 hands. I don't have 2 hands, but you can measure your distance between this point and the chassis and how high this is relative to this. So if you had like a straight line, brought it out there. I don't really do that. I just kind of look at it, to be honest. I think that's good enough. So what I've always done on pan cars over the years. So it's hard to capture on camera, but you can see the pod is drooping down a fair amount. I don't like to run that much. I'm trying to find a good angle. Anyway, so we've increased our pod droop significantly. The easiest way to check that, in my opinion, versus what we were just doing with the camera, is measure it. So pull up on this shock and then slide the gauge under. So we'll put the camera down. Pulling up on the shock, got the gauge, we'll slide it under. So we're like well north of 6. You may need another ride height gauge to check that. So right now we're going to crank the pod back down to where it had it. I also do this on touring cars. You measure your ride height. So right now at 4.5. Full droop, we're north of 6. So let's pull it down. That would give me like 1.5 mil of droop in my book. You can see how I crank this in, hold that. I'm sure there's a better way to hold this than pliers, but guess what? It works. It's just plastic. So now our ride height has been lowered. Slide this under. We're about 4 now. Pull the pod up. You can see the amount of droop relative is the same, but because our ride height's lower, our droop's also lower concurrently. Now, say we wanted to increase the ride height without increasing droop, you would just crank up the spring. So that's not going to make this total length any longer. It's just going to increase the ability for this spring to hold up all the weight. And if you change your spring rate, that's also something you'll need to recheck every time. So this is a pretty soft spring. That's why it's wound in a lot. If you use a stiffer spring, obviously this car would have a lot more ride height with a less preload. Something else to keep in mind. So now let's check our ride height. Should be more because we wound it up a bit. And 4 goes right under, closer to 4.5. And if you pull up on the car, so what we got, flip the gauge around, stopping right at about 6.5 or so. So really, the manual kind of explains it, but just think total length versus the amount of hold up that the spring gives you. That's your setting. So I think that's pretty easy to understand. I may have talked in circles a few times, but next we'll move on to the side springs, which is the key to this car. Your total droop and shock length is no different than any other car, really, for pan cars. So let's see, this side's probably better. Don't have as many motor wires in the way. So these side springs are the key to the F1 Ultra. So that's letter C in the book. Adjust the 2 micro shock collars for height C. Lowering collars raises the chassis. So turning them down raises the car up like any other car. But it's kind of important to make sure these shocks are the same length when you build them, because they do control your side pod droop. So like on a touring car, for example, that's not as critical because you have droop screws holding in the arms will set your droop. So if your shock's long enough that it never maxes out, it won't matter. On this, you will max out your shocks every time, kind of like an off-road car that doesn't have droop screws, like a 10 scale buggy. It's important to have your shock lengths perfect on those. So this is the same story. Side to side, shock lengths need to be the same. I don't know what mine are offhand, but they're the same. So this controls when your wheel lifts up the inside, you're good, and that controls the point at which this outside will stop extending. So lift the wheel this way, this shock will compress, and this one will extend. So when that reaches max extension, that's when it'll really only compress this side, if that makes sense. It's like a droop stop for the side. So if you make those longer, it'll allow the pod to articulate more without compressing outside as much. I think that will be good on a bumpy track. I just built mine per the manual and left it. It's not something I really tune with, but it's important that it's the same side to side. Because if you're compressing and this wheel stops coming down sooner than this side, your car will be tweaked. Hopefully that makes sense. All right, so now the final measurement point. We're going to be measuring here on the chassis. We were measuring here on the pod for the center shock, and then here is where we'll measure the side springs. Kind of illustrate where they end as well. So think about it, if this wasn't the correct length, you would have a tweaked car and it would never be right. Like I said, these are big rubber tires on an F1 car, especially if you're running a bumpy track. You might not notice a 1/2 mil or something, but you want to have it right. So push on the battery, get our settings good. Let's measure. So I'm at about 3.5. Keep in mind, I like to run this about 4, but we've been messing with the settings, so it may be off a touch. So if we want to raise that, you can crank up these side springs. Make sure you do them evenly. A few turns. A few turns. Now let's see. There we go. 4 slides under now. So it's the same on both sides. And because this chassis is so narrow, it's kind of hard to hit it perfect. But I'm trying to run 4 on both sides, and you're going to feel for when it contacts the actual chassis in the middle, not these side links. So it's important too to measure in the space of your side link, not where the plastic is, because you might contact this ball end before you contact the chassis right here. So you want to measure in this area, the side straight in. So like I said, we've been messing with the settings, so my car may be a little off. So it feels like I have more ride height on this side than this side. So crank this up a little. And there's also a relationship between these side springs and this. So if your center shock is maxed out on preload, you probably have something wrong. And you want to look at how much total droop you have. So you may need to run some more droop. 4 and 4 on that side. We're measuring against the chassis. Now we can see what it's like to check the front tweak. We're not going to go through the front end, but you measure the front wheels to make sure your rear end's set up properly. And that's when these will come into play. We'll get into that in a sec. All right, everybody. So we're going to check the front now. I went and fixed everything that I've kind of messed with in the video, just to give you one last idea of how I check all this. So we showed you how to do the rear. I'm running 5 mil rear ride height. You measure that right at the point of the pod. And this car's got a lot going on, so you kind of have to fish around with the long ride height gauge. We got 5 back there. That's not one you can really feel. But that's set like any other pan car on earth, with the cams and your tire height. And then we'll give it a little push. And then I'll check the pod in this area. Another way you can fish the ride height gauge in is between this point up to here. Make sure you're not hitting anything in the back. So we're contacting right there with this gauge. So we're at 4.5. It's right there. It's just barely giving me a little resistance when I slide it in. It's good. I have my whole car raked forward. So you'll notice my ride height goes from 5. And on the front, I've got about 3.5. Just contacting on the nose. So at this point, 4.5, checking on both sides. And there's also something you can play with. Just sit there and turn the collars, read the manual, kind of see what you get, and it'll help you understand. So we're at 4.5 at this point right here. Put the car another push down. Now we're going to measure under the chassis. Remember to go between the links. About 4. Stopping me at 4.5, so 4. A little tap. I feel a little bit of space there. It's good. Same on this side. 4 slide under. Stopped me at 4.5. Little tap. Little space. Perfect. So that means we have 5. 5 under the pod like any other pan car. These points are at 4.5. Point right there, 4.5. And then under the chassis at this point. And this point is 4. You could probably also measure here. I never did, because that starts to influence the front as well. I try to get as close to these springs as possible. So think about it the easy way. Cams control the rear ride height. Center shock controls mostly the height here on the pod. And then the side springs mostly control the chassis ride height. But it's important to know that the center shock and the side springs work together. So really read the manual, play with it, turn the springs up and down, play with your shock length, and that'll help you really understand it for yourself. So when you're at the track scrambling, trying to get something right, you'll know deep in your head, and you won't have to watch this video or read the manual, and you know what to do. I said, I don't get scientific with it. I don't ever even measure this length or the whole shock length. I just measure the ride height and the droop of the car. And droop's something you can pull up and feel, and you can look at on the chassis. You can measure it. Honestly, I never really do. It's something I look at. So I would say that's probably 2 mil of droop. And remember, you have that center spring. You don't want to compress that. And I've always told people over the years, 90% of getting your car good is making sure it's not tweaked, nothing's bent, broken, wrong, compressing the center spring. This spring was all wound all the way in, but this was incorrect. That's what gets you into trouble. Making sure everything's even and working smoothly is worth more than the correct setup. So now we'll go into the front. Like I said, I was running a raked setup, so 5 all the way in the back, 3 in the front. We're doing the Red Bull Racing full rake. So about 3.5 in the front, 5 in the rear. And because the front chassis is so narrow, you can't really get an idea of what the ride height is side to side. Like measuring this point here versus this point here really isn't going to be much different. So you want to go back to what I just said. Make sure your springs look correct. Make sure you have the same amount of shims going up and down. Sorry for the arrow pieces in the way. Make sure you have the same amount of shims in there. Make sure your spring isn't preloaded incorrectly. Make sure your little set screw that holds the axle in has been set up properly. That's what really matters more. Make sure nothing's tweaked or bound, moves freely with the tires off. That's what matters. So now I'm going to come back with the tweak wheels, and this is how I like to measure the front end, since it's hard to check the ride height on the front side to side. Okay, so now we have these RC Maker tweak wheels on the car. I think BS Works makes these too. A few people. These are the cool carbon ones. These are the touring car ones. They thread right on. Just make sure you don't tighten them all the way. Just so there's not much play in there. You also notice I'm running the Tamiya knuckles. I did that to get a little more trailing axle setup versus an inline. I like that feel. The track at Jackson for Nats was a little bumpy on the straightaway, and there's a lot of high speed sections. Made the car super easy to drive at speed because that trailing axle setup. F1's almost like a two-wheel drive buggy sometimes, and that really stabilizes two-wheel drive buggies on dirt. So why not on a bumpy asphalt track? All right, so what we're going to do here is, because we talked about a minute ago, we couldn't really check ride height side to side because the chassis is so narrow. There's no other pickup point that's valid, so we're going to have to measure right at the wheels. And this is actually really easy to do, and this is how you can ensure your rear pod's tweaked properly. Like I said, you want to make sure all your shims and everything are the same side to side. Make sure your kingpins move freely. This is like any other pan car. So if that's incorrect, everything else will be thrown off. There's no real science to that. There's nothing special about that for the Exotek. It's just your shim counts, same springs. One side's not preloaded more than the other. You can kind of push down and visualize it. I mean, the car looks pretty even. I was running the stock front springs. I never really messed with that. My car was pretty good and I was afraid to change it. So what you're going to do is you have to find the center point of the chassis, and we're going to lift the car up. So bear with me while I find the center point. Pull the car up to the edge. And make sure your tweak board's level also. This is on my workbench in my house. It's pretty level. If you're at a track and the board isn't level, this won't work. So we're going to lift up. I found the center point in the carbon of the chassis, not on the wing. Lift, and we watch which side lifts up sooner. They lifted up almost immediately the same. Let's try it again. Finding the center point, lift, watch which side lifts up first. I think the front left lifted up slightly quicker. So in that instance, that means this wheel lifts up sooner. So you'll want to turn up this side spring. That'll add more pressure to this, which will load the chassis in this direction. More pressure here equals more pressure here. So we'll turn that in like half a turn, maybe one turn. Resettle everything. And try again. There you go. That looked almost immediately for me, and that was a small turn. And really, this is kind of a verification for yourself that you set up the pod correctly. There you go. That's soon enough. This is an important thing. So like I said, I don't get technical in measuring this. I only measure these when I build them. I don't measure the distance between the preloads as long as they're, you know, eyeball close. Just measure your rear pickup, your side pod points, your chassis points, your total ride height front to rear, and check these. And if you don't have these RC Maker things, an old trick for 12 scale is you would put the tires on, put a penny on top of them, and lift up. It'll do the same effect because it'll want to pendulum down. Whichever penny dumps off first will be the one that lifts up earlier. But these really are nice to have. And that's really it. From that point, put the tires on and go. So checking this front tweak is really checking your rear pod as long as your front's set up properly. And yeah, that's it. Always keep in mind though that these are rubber tires. This isn't foam 12 scale, so they don't really wear uneven as far as height, but you have these big foams in them. They're not as precise as an old 12 scale or foam pan car, so there's going to be a little bit of margin of error, but that's a good and a bad thing. And that's really it. And then as far as front end geometry, I'm an old Automatics guy, so I always had the caster doodles to check this. I can't use the Exotek caster doodles, I don't think, because I have these Tamiya arms, they only work with the Exotek ones, I believe. Don't quote me on that. So I just measure these points, make sure they're even for your caster. And then on the camber, you can just use standard touring car camber gauges on the front. You don't really need the special adapters if you know how to thread them on there correctly. So I'll check camber on those, and then I leave these alone unless I want to actually make a caster change, which I never did really on asphalt. I kind of set it up to the manual and went with it. Another thing that's important is your side links have to be exactly the same length. If you make these incorrect, the whole pod will tweak and your car will never drive straight. That would be very bad for obvious reasons. Toe I set up on the touring car gauges. I will say, when I ran Nats, I never once put the car on camber gauges. It's something you can kind of just see with the tire, see if it wears evenly. And it goes running about 1 degree of camber. Worked well with these ride tires. And that's about it. So ride height, tweak, spring selection is really the key points. Making sure nothing's falling apart like any other car. I didn't do, only really like weird trick I did was a ton of weight on the rear pod for asphalt. That helped me start in the main too, so the car you could just grab full throttle on it would just go. It wouldn't light up the inside tire or anything. Running very light fluid in the gear diff. Wouldn't recommend that for carpet. I also ran the short wheelbase to help me in the 180s because I had a ton of downforce on the front. It was very good, very smooth on the high speed stuff. So I'm running the Protoform wing with full winglets in there. These little winglets right on the upper arms. That'll be unsprung downforce. The TRG rear wing, which I think is the biggest one I could find. Running it as high as it goes. I didn't run any extra weights on the rear, just directly on the pod, so unsprung. Yeah, and that's it. Just make sure everything's straight, nothing's tweaked. I know I talked in a lot of circles, but really just follow the manual, play with it, and you'll be good. I ran 400 CST, not 300 CST in the side shocks. Same with the center shock. Hope the car stay a little flatter. Yeah, there's not much else I can really think of. I guess this is the way you check the micro shock droop. I never actually did this. I would just kind of go by feel, how much droop I got. I tried to run not very much. The minimum amount before it starts compressing the center micro spring is what I liked on asphalt. And that's about it. Run the Ackerman to flip the inside wheel as much as possible, to scrub it. That helped me slow down in the little 180s. Because the inside wheel would slow down a lot compared to the outside, so the outside wheel isn't turning that much. The car would handle normally. The inside wheel would slow it down and scrub. That was good on asphalt. I wouldn't recommend that on high grip carpet, I don't think. And that's it. Thanks for watching. Leave any questions in the comments and I'll try to answer it. There you go.